Hey, Andrew here with a bonus video. The goal of this video is to give you a quick summary of everything we learned in this section. We're going to cover React components and we're going to talk about props versus state. It's just going to take a few minutes and it's a visual overview so you can just sit back and relax. So for this example, we're going to have my component. My component doesn't live alone. It was rendered at some point, whether it was rendered by another component or a React DOM.render call. So we're going to go ahead and define that by putting a parent over here. We don't really care about the implementation details of it. We just know that at some point something rendered my component. And we also know that my component could have optionally rendered a child component, though it didn't have to. And we'll put that over here. Now we know that data, props, they flow in one direction. That allows us to pass things between components. So the parent could pass some data, if any, to my component, and my component, if it had a child, could pass props down. We also know that my component is going to render something to the screen. There is rendered output, and this is just JSX. We have access to props and state when we're rendering. So let's go ahead and actually look at props and state side by side. And we start off with a few similarities. The first one being both are just objects. So this dot props is an object in our components. This dot state is an object in our components. Now the next similarity is that both can be used when we're rendering the component. So if some data gets passed into my component from the parent, I can access that when I'm rendering. We saw this with our option component. And if a component manages some state, it can use that state when it's rendering itself. We saw that with the add option component, which renders the error message that it keeps track of. So down below, we have access to props when rendering. We have access to state when rendering. The last big similarity is that changes to both cause re-renders. Now for state, the component itself can change the data. It does this with a this.setState call. It cannot change its own props. If the props for a component are going to change, that's because they're going to get passed down from the parent. So we saw our options component re-render the list when the parent component in Decision App passed a new array down. So the parent component maintains that changing data, it passed a fresh prop down, and that did indeed cause a re-render. Next up, we're going to dive into some of the differences. So the first one is that props come from above, whether it's a parent component or just some JSX that gets passed into React DOM.render, and state is defined in the component itself. Next up, props cannot be changed by the component itself, which we already talked about. So if some string was passed into my component and I rendered that, I wouldn't be able to change this.props dot some data in order to see it re-render. That's not going to work. If you do want to track changing data, you have to use state, because state can be changed by the component itself. So we've already seen all of this in action inside of our application. I just wanted to give you a nice visual representation of exactly what's happening. And now we have a little side-by-side comparison of the two. So there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. And we're going to get a ton more experience with props and state in the following sections. So that is it for this little bonus video. Feel free to refer back to it if you forget the differences. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and dive right into the next section.